How's it going, Trav?
Nick, doing well. How about you?
Been a minute. We're uh
Yeah.
we're down.
Mikey chasing some elk right now?
Yeah, he is. Bow in hand somewhere in the Colorado mountains.
Hell yeah, good for him. Good for him. I know we were talking about this before the pod started, when we hit record, but got my first racing wheel. Playing Xbox, playing Forza Motorsport. I know it's not like iRacing. I don't have a cockpit, folks. We're talking got weights on my behind my chair, got weights on my pedals. I just started using paddle shifters. I still stink. I'm still racing against AI, even though online for Forza is kind of worthless from what I've played. But man, it's been a lot of fun. I usually do it like sometimes between work hours. Like I work sales, I work a stressful job. So sometimes like when I've been on the phone for 45 minutes just hammering people and nobody's answering, I'll cut out, turn the Xbox on, and get a couple laps in and decompress. It's a one of the great things about sales is you control your own destiny and get to do kind of whatever you want as long as you close business.
100%. So which Forza are you playing? Are you playing Motorsport? Are you playing Horizon?
I've only played Motorsport, and I've actually been thinking about getting into some of the other like fringe games that are not fringe, but like some of the other like more arcade styles of games that are out there. I loved doing like racing games at like pizza parlors, right? You throw in quarters and turn on like Rush, Cruisin' or whatever. Those are the best.
Yeah. Have I ever shown you my rig? I've got my
Yeah,
rig
let's see it. I
sitting
think I've
right
seen a
over here.
picture, but
So you can see this closes up and that
cool.
turns into a cockpit. The monitor here will then rotate over there and be in front of the cockpit. So just have the monitor on an arm, so it works out well. One of my suggestions actually would be the F1 game. It is pretty approachable. You can control a lot of the settings in terms of like working into learning the tracks and utilizing like the actual driving line, and you can work your way into using like all the gears and shifting. You can do auto, manual, as well as kind of controlling the traction control. So I found my happy medium in F1 is medium traction control, still has ABS on. I'm doing all the gears, and then I still use the racing line, but I only you're able to set it up to have it only in the corners. So that's kind of the setup that I found works really well, and it allows you to race online when you don't necessarily like know this specific track like the back of your hand and have all the breaking points dialed. But yeah, we should definitely, even after this, I'm down to hit the track. I've got nothing to do, but
Yeah, for sure, man. It's funny you bring up the racing line. I haven't like financially dived into sim racing as a hobby, but I've actually like my wife calls me the most world's most informed consumer. Like I've actually done a pretty good bit of research on like what I think I'll like and stuff like that, and watched all like kind of the noob YouTube channels like Jimmy Broadbent. Like I love Jimmy Broadbent.
yeah, Jimmy's a good dude.
Big fan, and like one of the things he said, like he was like don't get intimidated by the people who are doing no racing line and like you're doing the hardest settings. Like it takes time and you really have to get into it. So I got racing line on. I just turned shifters on, and I think the next games I have picked out, I wanted to get Assetto Corsa because, well, first of all, the things that interest me in racing are like imitating current racing series. Like I really want to do like an IndyCar, NASCAR, Chili Bowl kind of deal, whatever. And so I know that iRacing is where I need to get, but I think Assetto Corsa kind of offers some of that, and they have that new one coming out
So
in a
I
few
will
months.
say, so Assetto Corsa, and you're talking about ACC, so Assetto Corsa Competizione,
No,
correct?
no, no. I'm talking about the original Assetto Corsa. So Competizione is only GT3, right?
Not necessarily. They do have some other cars. But I like in terms of like absolute simulators. I think you've got iRacing that's kind of the top dog. But Assetto Corsa and Assetto Corsa Competizione is like right there. Like it's that next one, and it's definitely the one that's the most accessible for console. I think you can maybe do iRacing on console, but it's definitely more tailored to a better PC experience where you can add a spotter, you can add some other things to make that game a little bit easier because it is very serious. But no, I think you like. if you're looking to imitate like series like that, I think Assetto Corsa, the original. I actually did a lot of drifting in Assetto Corsa, the
Yeah, I
original.
saw your e-brake in your setup.
Yeah, yeah, I've got an actual. It's not hydraulic, but I've got the actual e-brake that is off to the side, and got a
Yeah,
little kind of
sweet.
like homemade mounting plate that is off of the existing shifter that was kind of with this rig setup.
Hell yeah, that's cool, man. That's sweet. Yeah, I'm excited to get into it. I think iRacing is kind of the end goal because, like, truly, I'm a racing dork. We have a racing podcast that like 15 people listen to, and so like I love my favorite things about racing are the intricacies of like hitting the exact same lap over and over again and managing your tires, or like draft racing, like really simple stuff like that. Really, like I love that. So I'd love to get to iRacing. I know it's a long way away, and I know that I have a lot of learning to do, but in the moment, it's been a blast. Like it's been. I wasn't sure what to expect. I'd played Forza for like probably 50 hours with a controller, and I knew that if I was going to get any better, like further my enjoyment, I was going to have to get a wheel. I was not sure about it. It's dope. I love it.
So talking about you an informed consumer, I feel like I'm definitely the same way, and I did a lot of research on getting mine. I noticed you also have a Logitech wheel. Did you get the G29 or did you get the 923?
I
Because
got
I
the
have.
920. So the
Okay,
920, I think the only difference is yours is direct drive and mine's not.
not quite. So I think mine has two gears as opposed to just one to drive it. So there's kind of a driving motor on either side of the gear. It's still gear driven. It's not a direct drive wheel. The biggest difference that I've noticed is the brake. So have you? Is yours just completely stock? Did you like get it from eBay or anything
Yeah,
like
I got
that?
it. I got it from eBay, and I've noticed that my brake like it's actually really good. I think like the only thing is I don't get pushed back, but there is enough tension in the brake where like I can kind of feather the brakes. I can really hammer the brakes into a hairpin if I want to. Like it's very pressure sensitive.
The biggest difference in an easy mod you can do to those is there's a little rubber thing you can put in there, and it kind of acts as a stopper at the end, and it provides what feels like a bite point. That's essentially what they did with the 923 with what I got. It's
Mm,
got a progressive spring, so there's like a part of the spring that is like easier to compress, and then from there it gets a lot harder, and it gets that feel of the bite point of the brakes. And like when you get to the point of, okay, I'm going to be pulling, ABS completely off, to get that feeling of this is the bite point, it gives you a little bit more feedback. It's not necessarily feedback, and that's where some nicer brake pedals is good. But dude, I've had this entry level setup with a foldable sim rig, the Logitech stuff, and have not upgraded it. And I have probably close to 1,000 hours over the course of a few years in driving games. And it's like,
that's cool,
could
man.
I have upgraded? Absolutely. But what I love about this wheel specifically, it's the same one that you have. It's not the best at any one thing, but it can do everything. So it allows me to do formula racing. It allows me to do GT racing. It's a full wheel, so it allows me to do drifting. Also allows me to do NASCAR. And it's not the perfect wheel for necessarily any one of those individual. There's always going to be something better in each category. I really do think it's the best, like, all arounder, and especially getting into sim racing until you decide, like, okay, I've really decided this is the type that I've really enjoyed, because there's a lot of different shit you could do. Then you can decide about maybe specializing, but even then, like, sim rig gear is expensive, and it's like the experience that I get with this,
Yeah,
entry level setup from Logitech is really, really solid.
yeah, for
Super
sure.
side tangent that I don't think we've really talked about this in any detail on the pod, but
No, it's
I'm
cool.
definitely
It's
a big sim racing nerd. I've obviously uploaded some of those hot lap videos, but it doesn't show the behind the scenes stuff. And I had to figure all this shit out by myself. So, I'm happy to help, and always, love to welcome people with open arms into the sim racing community, because it's just a lot of fun. And the other piece that I wanted to touch on was in iRacing. I think the piece you're really going to enjoy is NASCAR. I don't think that there's any other game that does NASCAR as well as iRacing does NASCAR. It's really, really good. It's a lot of fun. There's a ton of different types of cars and eras as well. The one downside to iRacing is you have to buy each car individually. You have to buy each
yeah.
track individually. And so, like, over the years, I've definitely spent a lot of money on just the subscription, but then you add up all the shit that I've bought in tracks and cars and stuff. And, like, it is expensive. The one thing is, if you stick with it, you've then got all of those. So if a series ever pops up with that in it, you're like, oh, screw it, I'll go pop into this. Um, all things considered, I do wish I bought probably about half of the iRacing stuff that I have, and then maybe I could have upgraded the sim rig. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, for sure, man. Well, no, I think this is a good tangent. I think that the reason, I mean, the closest any of us are ever going to get to getting in a race car for the most part, unless you're really well off and like you have a car that you can go burn tires on and whatever, is getting in a sim racing rig. So it's cool. I'm glad we got to talk about it, but we also probably should talk about F1 at some point today, especially with the constructors, just absolute the hot stove of the constructors right now.
Yeah. So what did it get down to? Is it down to 10 points?
Yeah, I think Ferrari is 20 points behind McLaren. This is really good radio right now. We're trying to figure out the standings in the meantime of recording a podcast. But I was listening to something kind of post race on, I think it was on the broadcast, and Ferrari believe they have a constructors contending team, and I totally agree. They look awesome on tracks with low downforce. Like there's not really anybody whose car is as nice to tires as Ferrari's is. Not even close.
Which is really surprising. I feel like the nice on tires piece is a new element, as well as them being good on low downforce tracks, because historically, like, you know, in the year of, last year, big Max dominance, but Charles and Sainz were both able to be up there and really contend in Monaco and at those high downforce tracks.
Yeah,
So it's
Azerbaijan
interesting.
too, I think.
It's which Azerbaijan has such long straights. That's kind of like a hybrid track.
Yeah,
Like that has one of the longest straights on the
that's a good point.
calendar. But it's interesting. And the one piece that I did want to call out was the just the tire wear, because it seemed like from the McLaren pit wall, they didn't think that they were going to be able to pull off that one stop strategy. And both tires talked about, I think it was front left graining, because there's a lot. It's a clockwise circuit, which means there's a lot of fast right-handers. The front left is going to be taking a lot of that, heat. It got to the point at the end where it was like it felt like they had to pit, but even with that pit, there wasn't quite enough time to make it up. And it really, unless Charles got a puncture, which he didn't, he was able to have, enough pace to hold on. Yeah, so from a constructor side, it's down to 8 points between Mercedes and Red Bull, and then Ferrari is a little bit back.
McLaren and Red Bull.
Yeah, McLaren and Red Bull, sorry. Ferrari's a little bit farther back at 407 versus the 438 of McLaren Mercedes.
They're right there. I mean, that's one DNF from both teams, right? Like that's
100%.
that's
It's a
it's right
three-car
there.
fight, which it didn't look that way. Ferrari's kind of pulled a few out of the bag, I feel like, a few really good performances. Charles, podium, and then, Charles win here. Really interesting. And, so in terms of the race at Monza, the other thing that I want to talk about was how about that move from Oscar Piastri into turn 4? Obviously, it took some compliance from Lando Norris, and like if that's a different team, realistically, he gets shoved off track.
Yeah.
And that's what probably happens, or they wreck. And Lando had the foresight to not do that. At the end of the day, took some compliance from the driver on the inside, but it was a hell of a fucking move.
It was.
To
I
test it.
was talking to. I was playing golf and was watching the race on my phone, and I was riding with my dad, who like casually watches F1. He watches it because I do. Doesn't care very much, but he was asking about that move, and the way I described it, it was perfect car positioning. You couldn't have been in a better spot. Perfect on the brakes, and that's the only way you pull that move off. He almost spun Lando out, but like, dude, talk about like the most British gentlemanly respect. I know he's Australian, but the most like respectful racing move you can possibly pull off. Put his car on the inside, and absolutely nailed it. It was great, and I loved hearing about the papaya rules after this, because I hadn't heard much at all. Like I didn't really.
That's the first I think they've ever mentioned it.
So I
was
dug
from the
into it.
radio. Yeah.
I dug into it a good bit afterwards. I watched a bunch of clips where they talked about it, and Zach Brown, first of all, I don't know if you've seen the clip with Nico Rosberg, who's absolutely grilling him about not giving Lando priority. It's amazing. Nico is never afraid to let it rip, and that was the clip that was very, that was the clip that was very telling to me because Zach thinks that they both can win a championship, and they're like it's just a really weird like they're gonna fumble the constructors championship if they do that. It's not just the two drivers fighting. There are positions that are to be given up if you get out of position when you're racing your teammate and the first moves of the lap. And it was very clear that Zach Brown is just like he's caught kind of between a rock and a hard place. Like he's got two rock star drivers. They're both fucking awesome. They're the drivers that have come around the most this year from last year. Lando's kind of started last year, but they're really good. And he doesn't really know what to do. And I'm not sure I would know what to do either. They're both great.
So I think on this note, I think that obviously they are not prioritizing Lando. And like that's clear with him giving up the race win in Hungary and letting Oscar kind of go at it in turn one and lap one. And I think the more level headed kind of approach to that is, hey, we should capitalize on this one too. Oscar, like, in the turn one melee, like I don't think you can throw that extra layer of don't pass your teammate, but maybe don't go for a fucking audacious overtake, right? Like that's kind of where I think that communication is lacking from the team side. And it just is, it feels like they don't give a shit about the drivers, is what it really feels like, is they are focused in on the constructors and they will roll with whatever driver is the best on that day. More often than not, it is still Lando up to this point, but there's more and more times, especially this season, obviously, that Oscar's really been on it, and he hasn't had those fall offs in pace that we saw last year, where Lando, even if he had a bad start, would just kind of walk him down. And so I would, love to see them taking the driver's standings seriously, because like there could have been, and I think there still can be, if this is the Red Bull form that we're going to see, you know, I think there definitely can be a battle between Max and Lando, um, but it's going to take a little bit of prioritization from the team side, I think, for that to really happen, and it just doesn't feel like it's coming, which is a little bit frustrating as obviously a Lando Norris fan. At the end of the day, I am still a McLaren fan, so I don't hate, seeing Oscar do well. Whereas there was a bit of frustration watching what transpired in Hungary. When I was frustrated at a McLaren 1-2. That was
Yeah.
just because of, and I think the other piece that we haven't talked about yet is the missteps by the McLaren team. Whether it be they just misjudged and they could have gone through that grading period, but obviously they made an error in strategy and handed that race to Charles. At the very least, Oscar should have won that race.
Well, I wanted to talk about this. We were talking about Ferrari earlier, and that was like my biggest takeaway from this race was how far Ferrari's come since Mattia Binotto is not involved in race decisions anymore. That was I would say I disagree with you. I don't think McLaren fucked up. I think it was a Monza eats tires, and I think everybody before the race thought it was a two-stop, and
Well,
even
it
Red Bull
didn't
tried
used
it.
to, though. Actually, Monza didn't used to eat tires, but
Well,
with
they
this
resurfaced it.
resurfacing,
Yeah.
with this resurfacing, it was way more abrasive.
Well, then I think everybody thought it was going to eat tires, and you even saw Red Bull try it early in the race, and it didn't work. They had to pit.
They were the earliest committal to that two-stop.
Yeah, and I thought it was super interesting. And you mentioned the reason I brought this back up is you mentioned that grading period. We've seen grading in the past where, Lewis used to do it all the time when he had major grading, and you just kind of drive through it. And sometimes that works out, and they, full credit to them, wonderful strategy call. Really, they seem to be developing a much, much better system for making the decisions from the house, but also communicating with the drivers about the right things and what they can feel in the car. So, I thought that was, super impressive, and if they continue this trend, they're going to be nasty next year with Lewis and Leclerc in the car.
I agree, and definitely was a thought that crossed my mind as well, because you know, no, like it feels like the Ferrari of old when they're on Plan J. Like the first few years of Carlos Sainz, and like Carlos, what do we think about Plan H? Plan H, and it's like, bro, how are we this far down the alphabet? Like, what the fuck are we
I
doing?
know.
And so,
There's some races where like you'd hear him recommend like, do you want to do plan A, B, or C? It's like, no. Like, what do I do? I'll tell you how the car is feeling.
yeah, this
Like,
needs to be a two-way relationship, but I can't be the strategist and the driver. And
no,
that's what
for
they were
sure.
asking at the beginning because they were so just up shit's creek. And so that was totally a thought that crossed my mind as well when kind of watching the and it's this is not just like a single stroke of brilliance. They've been there a few times to pick up the pieces of what looked like they were, not even close to in contention. And I think it was Charles and Zandvoort ended up on the podium. And then, picking up a win, pulling off the one stop that the McLarens didn't think they could pull off. Um, it was really really impressive, and like from the Ferrari side, don't know how much of it is like this is a little bit of conspiracy theory, but like I feel like they might know, like, right, maybe they resurfaced Faenza, which is their own track with the same resurfaced track, and like, right, like, could they have had a little bit of intel there, or did they have like the upgrade that they put on this weekend? Did it make it actually be a better car on the tires and perform better over the full race stint? So it'll be interesting to see the way that pans out. But they've been there now 2 weeks in a row, not necessarily in complete contention for overall pace, but end up with a very, very good finishing result by having a car that performs very well in race conditions.
Yeah, for sure, man. I totally agree. So before we move on to, I want to talk a little bit about Red Bull as well. Maybe
Yeah.
Mercedes. Not much to say there, but um, two driver questions. You over the next 5 years, if they stayed in the exact same car they're in right now and they continue to improve. I know that's not a realistic scenario, but do you take Piastri or do you take Lando Norris?
Like, that's a tough question. Me being a Lando fan, obviously. But
Yeah.
there is an element of like he's a guy in his sixth season versus a guy in his second season. Few kinks in the armor that hadn't necessarily showed themselves. Like Lando's always had a lot of promise. Um, but I think you maybe put your eggs in the Piastri basket just knowing that he's there or thereabouts and 4 years younger in his career. And that obviously pains me to say, but I think that in terms of Lando, right? Like this is going to be a big make or break year for kind of all the critics that we talked about, and I think that going into next year, he is going to be approaching it as I'm fighting for the title. I think it'll be really interesting next year to see how that inner team battle in McLaren plays out. To see
So who you
whether
taking?
I think that for your specific question, Piastri, and I think that the reason why I say that is just specifically, it's like you got a dude thereabouts 4 years younger in his career.
Yeah, for
Five
sure.
years later, like Lando's, not getting old, but like he's older. You can't still have another, 8 years with that guy as the center of your team. You can have that as your, case with Piastri more often than not. And so I think even me as a Lando fan, you got to take Piastri in that instance. We're staying in the exact same cars. He's been figuring it out. They're pretty close to one another. Um, you got to think he's going to continue to progress. But that's just with what I've seen from Lando and kind of the relationship that he has with McLaren and not necessarily having been prioritized. And so I don't necessarily see that changing, but I do see like you saw it happen in Hungary and like he finally cooperated, but I feel like that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and it's like, all right, at the end of the day, like I have to prioritize me to win a drivers championship. I
Yeah, I
still
think they
think
both realize that.
yeah.
I think Piastri and Lando are both starting to realize that, and I think that's fine. We saw a lot of great teammate battles over the years. I don't know if they have quite frankly, a fast enough car to do it. Like it's the fastest car on the grid right now, but it's really tight. Like it's really tight race. So um,
We've seen this year how fast that can change.
for sure, yeah. And with I think that's a good opportunity to pivot to talk a little bit about Red Bull. Obviously, kind of a weird weekend. I think like one of the first things I noticed is in quali. That track is so tight in margins, right? Like it's such a fast track. There's not as many corners.
There's not a lot of turns, is what I think
No,
really comes down to.
yeah, and like driver skill is really on play and really at play. And watching the McLaren go on there on rails and like absolutely ripping around the corner, every turn looking like the pool chicane at Monaco, like just absolutely flying. And Red Bull, like that car was so unsettled the whole time, and they weren't that far off the pace, but over like that's a really long and fast race, and over the 53 laps of the race, like it really showed. And their car even looked different. Like they had the only noticeably different rear wing out of anybody. Everybody else had kind of everything was flat. There were some that had like pointed ends, some that had like kind of more rounded off ends, but the Red Bull was like a straight W. It was very different looking, and they're trying some stuff.
They didn't have a specific specification wing for Monza, so they decided to adapt a low downforce wing. So that being said, that means that they ended up having more downforce than anybody else.
Yeah.
But because there's so few corners, at the end of the day, it didn't make that much of a difference. They were getting screwed at both ends. They were slow on the straights, and they were just only marginally like baby bit faster in the corners, and it wasn't near enough to make up how much slower they were on the straights. And so that was what I heard on their rear wing. But apparently Max reverted in FP3 and ended up running it in the race to an old specification floor because he was so frustrated with the car balance. And then that being said, the new specification floor actually was 0.2 faster, and so that's why Sergio was so close to him this race, which is, I think, kind of makes sense, because this was the first time in a long time that we've seen Sergio, pretty close to Max's gearbox for the first 30 laps of the race, right? Within, before the second set of pit stops, right? After the first set, even, he was right there. And then the second set of pit stops, Max finally kind of built a gap, but Sergio was right there. But they're kind of in shambles. It's if you're reverting backwards in what used to be a top tier car, and apparently they didn't consult the factory to do that. That was just Max being Max and saying, like, give me the old floor, because that used to have good balance. Well, it ended up with their current developments, it did nothing for them.
Yeah, I mean, of course. Yeah, they're in a really weird spot right now. It's been really so. I saw something after the race where Helmut Marko. It was like Monday or Tuesday. Today's Tuesday, so it was in the past few days. Helmut Marko released it. Really? Don't have kids. Just time is a flat circle. Yeah, so no, I was reading this morning, I guess then. But Helmut Marko put out a statement saying that like Max figured out the reason that the car was suffering from performance in a meeting. Like they were having an engineering meeting, and Max brought up something, and I think like they've kind of, at least according to Helmut, who doesn't bullshit, like he's a straight shooter, they've at least identified kind of what's going on with their car. And who's to say if they have the budget for it? I think they're pretty stretched already and pushing development towards 25 and 26, but yeah, I think they figured it out.
So I mean, I think that's an optimistic take, personally. Like,
listen, I'm just repeating what I read.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, I don't
totally
believe it.
You. And totally agree that Helmut Marko normally doesn't come out with bullshit, and Max really does know what he's doing. So, like, that is not an outlandish statement, but it is an optimistic statement. With that said, like, I heard a few things around this, and kind of a few layers. Is the first being like they don't have Adrian Newey in their back pocket anymore. He's stepped away from F1 operations and like hasn't been involved with the car since May, and when that decision happened, and who knows if he had, maybe had been stepped away. I think Red Bull kind of saw this coming, and apparently earlier in the year they actually went in a direction that Newey wasn't necessarily fully happy with. And he ended up like, I don't know if it was a part of it, but ultimately they went in that direction. And all the other layer is apparently this kind of imbalance of the car started to rear its head in Austin of last year, but they were so far ahead that they didn't really have to worry about it and they were able to work around it. And then, you got to think they don't have as much wind tunnel time. Not only with the penalty that they have on the wind tunnel time for going over the cost cap, but then they also have the least wind tunnel time to start off with from being a constructor. And so it's like, I wonder how much of this is self-inflicted. I also wonder how much of this is cost capped and the reverse allocation of wind tunnel time working bit to close up the field. And then, the final thing that I want to, think about is going into the final year of regulations where all of these teams are going to be pushing for that last little bit. I wonder how many teams, like, I don't think what Red Bull is going through right now is going to be a anomaly, right? I could see where, if we've got a development graph and it gets all the way close up to what that maximum is, and it actually probably then ends up dropping back down and then maybe going back up close. And we're probably kind of in that Red Bull dip right now, and I think they'll still finish the regulations strong. But I wonder how many other teams that are going to go through this as well, where they end up making a slightly wrong turn, trying to push the absolute smallest bit that is left in the regulations where they can exploit and kind of turn down the wrong path. Like that's kind of where I'm going. It's like I think this could be because Red Bull was so much closer to that ceiling, so much faster than anybody else. I think we could see this repeated with some other teams like a Mercedes, like a Red Bull. Hopefully not my McLaren boys, but you know, it's something I think could be on the horizon where, ultimately at the end of these regulations, we're getting closer and closer to what is the absolute optimal car under the current rule set. And that's why it gets closer and closer and why the racing is so good. And I'd love to see it's the same thing in 21. I wish we could have seen just like at least one, maybe two more years of those same cars. But then it defeats the purpose of Formula One in terms of being the top tier motorsport in innovation and working with these top tier constructors. So
Yeah, for sure, man. Lot of interesting developments to come. Speaking of developments, we have a driver lineup for Mercedes in 2025. Kimi Antonelli. Not to say I'm a prophet, but I did call it on the very
you
first
called
episode.
it very early.
I love Kimi. Like I know he's Toto's boy. Kimi Antonelli he's 18 years old. He's getting in an F1 car for the first time. He is mega fast by all accounts. He has not had the best F2 year for sure. But every other racing series that he's done since he was a kid, he has absolutely ripped everybody apart. He's a really, really fast driver. I think the thing that I've watched some F2 this year specifically to watch Kimi because I knew he was probably going to be here. And the thing that I've noticed about him is he is not afraid to stick his nose in a corner. And that's really fun. I think we need some of those drivers in F1, especially with George. I want to see George pushed a little bit. We've talked about this before, but I don't think Lewis is pushing him. I think that nobody's really racing him right now. I think Lewis is better than him, and I want to see him try to be the top dog against somebody who is, by all accounts, the best young driver since Max. So very, very excited for Kimi. Not sure if it's going to keep me a Mercedes fan. I'm looking really, really hard at that Ferrari red and following my guy Lewis, but I'll definitely pull for him. I'm stoked to see him get in the car next year.
Yeah, and on that note, if anyone didn't see it, he participated in FP1 this weekend. Went out, just put his balls on the table, was top of the times. Really, not because he really ultimately was being the fastest. He was the one that was willing to go push on a brand new track surface harder than anybody else because he is a young, excited man. And
Yeah.
first lap, Stormer circulates the track a few more times. His second push lap in Parabolica puts it in the wall. It was interesting, and I kind of talked about it in our group thread. They resurfaced the track. They did I heard them talking about how there's a little bump on the inside of Parabolica now. It was catching a lot of drivers out, so Colapinto, the other rookie, ended up going into the gravel during that same FP1 session there.
Burt
Um,
Nylander.
Burt Mylander, same place he crashed, which is the safety car. A bunch of other wiggles in practice. I think Alonso had a wiggle, Hulkenberg had a wiggle. So definitely was catching a lot of other drivers out just to give him the benefit of the doubt. But there also is something to be said of he's a young dude and not knowing how to ease into things. Obviously very excited to just try and show his pace and kind of prove himself. And the ultimate worst case scenario for him and the team happened, which was him wrecking George's car. And then it was quite funny in the timing of all of it because he puts it in the wall in FP1 one day, and the next day he is announced as the Mercedes driver. So obviously that was already drawn up. The dude had some pace and he was showing it, but he also showed his inexperience in the same breath.
Yeah, I worried about it. It's his first time in an F1 car. Well, in an F1 car in an official capacity, I guess. Toto's quote saying that he decided 5 minutes after Lewis told him he was going to Ferrari is awesome. The kid is awesome. He's special. I'm really excited. Both him and Behrman. Behrman has been mega this year in Formula 2, and really excited to see them both in F1 cars next year. It's gonna be really really cool.
There's obviously levels to everything, and I think you've got Kimi as that kind of like he's the top of his crop of drivers, without a doubt. There's not anybody that's talked about in that same regard. There's a lot of guys kind of talked about in the same regard as Ollie Behrman, but there's something to be said of take advantage of circumstance. He got a chance to drive a Ferrari, and he performed well and got points in his first drive. Is he going to have the outright pace that Kimi is going to have immediately? No, but is he a solid driver? Absolutely. And that's kind of, I think the biggest difference between those two is just you're looking at Kimi as like, we know that he's going to be that guy. Whereas Ollie, if he ends up being, and having proper pace, we're like, what I thought was so cool, even in those 2 laps of Kimi's in the FP1, if you think about all of the rookies, talk about the 10 or so rookies that have been in FP1 sessions or, actually gotten into the sport of Formula One, Mick Schumacher, Nikita Mazepin, even Lance Stroll when he first got in. If they weren't in that top tier, they definitely ease into it. And it's not uncommon, like obviously adios Logan Sargent, thank God. But, Logan Sargent's first 10 sessions, like the dude's like still easing into the pace. And so you obviously would much rather have that situation. And Toto said the same thing where you're having to tell a guy to be like, hey, find the limits of the car because it's probably a bit below what you feel like it can be, as opposed to having to teach someone to find the limit. Doing that, as Toto said, is impossible. Like you can't teach underlying pace and in this level of motorsport. You either have it or you don't. And there's a level of, that driver that I think you have to be able to do that. What I think is always the most impressive with top tier drivers is adaptability. And, I think that's a huge underrated characteristic in any motorsport. But like whenever you talk about these prodigy sort of drivers, the Lewises, the Maxes, and now the Kimmys, they immediately hop in the car and they're on the pace. Like it's almost like no learning period. And that's kind of like one of those things where you can't teach that. Like that is just such an innate skill and feel that's like hand-eye coordination. You can't teach hand-eye coordination. You either have it or you don't. You can refine it, but if you don't have hand-eye, you're not playing baseball. Like it's that simple. You stopped playing baseball and you went to play soccer when you were 8. If you didn't have hand
Yeah.
eye.
It's funny, kind of closing the loop on the sim racing thing in the beginning. One of the things I saw is like before you learn to drive fast, you have to learn how to spin out. and like you have to learn kind of the edges of the car. And I think like every driver, like the difference between a good driver and a great driver is two things: consistency, obviously number one, but number two, being able to understand where the edge is. And everybody thinks they have an understanding of the edge, but only a few drivers really know where the edge is. And like being able to push a car when they need to and manage the tires and get that extra feel out of the car is really big. And I think both Behrman and Kimi have a chance to be that guy. They're both really good. Behrman was immediately awesome last year in the Ferrari. So what else do you want to talk about before we get out of here?
Wanted to just call out my boy Lando's dominant win in Zandvoort last week because it was nice to see a McLaren win that I was not frustrated by. With Hungary being the most previous one, was hopeful.
Zandvoort's also awesome too, man. Like what a cool track.
It's a tough track for racing, but a really fun one to drive. Really fun one to drive. I don't think the game quite does it justice to what it looks like those guys run through in the banking.
Yeah, it looks crazy.
No, it was really interesting to see the level of pace that the McLaren just had, and that ended up being the biggest winning margin of the year, even more than some of the early wins that Max had. So, thought that they were going to be able to pull it off, but ultimately being competitive and Zandvoort is, because of all the undulation and only the one straight, it's a very high downforce circuit. Being so competitive there, but then also going to the lowest downforce circuit and the highest speed in Monza, and at least being competitive, right? Like that's hopeful that we're going to be able to pull out the constructors throughout the rest of the year. But no, great. I just wanted to call that out. Like it was great to see Lando get a win that it didn't feel like and there is not necessarily an asterisk because everything happens in Formula One, and sometimes it falls your way and sometimes it doesn't, but he did get lucky with the safety car in Miami to win that race. Whereas in Zandvoort he got passed for the lead again. Entirely different topic that Lando needs to work on his starts, and everybody knows that, but then passed Max on the track and never looked back. And
it was a great drive, man. It was a really good drive. He went and got up the road. That was fun to watch. Before we get out of here, two really cool things have I got to do my American Motorsports Minute. Two really cool things have happened in NASCAR in the past 2 weeks. If you're not aware, NASCAR playoffs start this week in Atlanta. The playoffs are a fucking joke. Like, don't even get me started on how NASCAR decides their championship. But they last 2 weeks were to get in the playoffs. There's like the way they do it. They have, I think it's like 8 or 10 automatic qualifiers, and then the last few races, there's one person that can qualify and lock in their spot for the playoffs. It's actually really cool the way they do it, even though the playoffs are meaningless. But last week, two really cool tracks too. Last week was Daytona, and then this week was Darlington. A fantastic mid-sized short oval, really cool. But Daytona last week, Harrison Burton won, and he won. It was an unbelievable finish. He won. Draft racing is the sickest. I'm still like I'll die on that hill. But so the story's really cool. He lost his job. He races for Wood Brothers Racing. They're a small Chevy team, and he lost his job. I think AJ Allmendinger is going to race for them next year. No, Justin Allgaier is going to race for them next year. But he wasn't re-signed for the year. He's the son of Jeb Burton, the guy with a really high, whiny voice on the NASCAR broadcast, old school racer, and he hasn't won a race in NASCAR at all. He got really lucky with some of the positioning and the cautions, and on the last lap of Daytona threw an unbelievable block on Kyle Busch, who also needed to qualify to win the playoffs. And if you know anything about Kyle Busch has never been shy to throw a bumper in somebody to get a win, but he raced him clean. It was really, really clean, good, hard racing, and Harrison Burton won, and it was fucking awesome, dude. Like, his interview after the race was so cool. He literally said, he's like, I got fired from this job, but I made a bet with my pit crew chief that if we win this race, we're going to stay here. So We're going to be at a bar somewhere. Y'all come find us, and we're going to fly out the next day, and just really cool, man. Jeb, his dad, was in the booth for the win, was going nuts, and they're like crying during interviews and stuff like that. It was just like beautiful, good American racing. So that was one, and then this week was equally as cool. Chase Briscoe, who's a great driver. I think he won a championship a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken. He's kind of fallen off. He's kind of had a tough year. He drives for Stuart Haas Racing, Gene's brother, in that in the NASCAR series, who are closing their doors after this, and they're shutting down the race team. He won last night in Darlington, a great race, by the way, worth going back and watching. It's a really fun racetrack. Multiple lines and everything like that. The good stuff that you see on those mid-size ovals. But he won, and their crew chief was absolutely going nuts. Like, everybody in the pit crew's crying. And the crew chief afterwards, like, straight up called out Stewart Haas Racing. He was like, there's 314 employees here that don't deserve any of the, he basically said any of the bullshit that we had to go through this year. We're closing our doors, but, like, we're here to win a championship. And just like two really, really cool back-to-back wins for drivers who either hadn't gotten a win or haven't had a win in a long time in kind of a tough situation. So NASCAR has been wonderful in the past month or so.
Yeah, definitely. I saw that win, super unexpected from that guy at Daytona.
Yeah.
Not only putting the block on Busch, but there was a lot of big guys, thereabouts, and normally, more often than not, they find a way to pull it out, and the little guys don't end up with the win. So
they had a fast car, man. He was hanging. Like, it wasn't just like a last minute overtime safety car, and he got through everybody. He was there through the last like 3 or 4 cautions from like 50 laps in. He was in the top 15 and got in a really good spot, and like, dude, just put some crazy moves on people and like ripped past people. Really, really sharp draft racing. It was awesome.
Yeah. Only other, motorsports. I'm gonna get on a slight tangent here, but motocross. Don't know if you follow that at all.
Not at all. Tell me about it.
Grew up riding dirt bikes, but there's a guy named Brian Deegan way back in the day. Ended up making this brand, Metal Militia. His son now is racing in the 250 class. He got second in Supercross, which is like the indoor. Ended up winning the motocross championship like a couple weeks ago. Which that's the only a little bit of a tangent. Hard to call that cool. Motorsport.
I know
Deeks.
Deeks.
4 wheels. Yeah,
I know Deeks. His daughter's in. She did Craftsman trucks for a little while. Listen, she's not great. Yeah.
So actually, she was in Xfinity this year.
Yeah.
And I think she actually lost her drive.
She did halfway through the season.
Yeah. I think, this is another entirely side note. I think for her, she just kind of moved up a little bit too quick. Is kind of what ended up happening. Like, she wasn't really doing much. The truck series is really hard, but she wasn't necessarily performing crazy well, and still got, promoted to the Xfinity, and I just don't think was quite ready for it.
Yeah, I don't think so.
She did some stuff last year in some like Legends races. I think it was like the TMX car. I can't remember what it's called. But she ended up like winning a few she's still a good driver. It's just unfortunate. Like, she was never on a super good team in either of the stints she had in Craftsman Truck or Xfinity. But just didn't work out for her.
Yeah, she got a good opportunity and took it, and I would have done the same thing. But yeah, I hope she comes back. She was she's good for the sport. Like, any female drivers are great. I really think Jamie Chadwick has a chance to be in a serious IndyCar drive in the next few years. She's killing it in Indy and NXT, won a race and everything. So I'd love to see her through.
And she throttles dudes every time she ends up in a series with dudes. So like, I agree. I'd love to see her get some sort of open wheel drive. I think obviously F1 is a little bit of a stretch at this point in her career.
She's not in the pipeline anymore, but she's in the Indy pipeline now, and I think she'll get there.
Yeah, I hope so as well, because, Danica was not it right?
No,
So need to make a name for female drivers in the more modern age because
need many of them.
Danica,
We
yeah.
need more. We need
Well,
people to sponsor female drivers just like they do male. And I really don't think like I
we're
feel
at the
like
tip
I
of the
know it's
iceberg. We're
yeah
at the tip of
yeah
the iceberg
absolutely.
with it, with all the stuff with Formula One finally investing into it and actually having built series for women. That is, that's the first time that's ever happened. And so, Title IX was a thing in U.S. for that, and like right, that helped grow women's sports. This is kind of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to that for women's motor racing. Is the way I look at it.
I hope so too. Academy's been cool this year. A lot of really good drivers winning. Abby Pulling is crushing it. She
Yeah.
was for a little context though. Jamie Chadwick was dusting her back when the W Series was there. So take it for what it's worth, but it's still fun racing. So we should get out of here. But Nick, it's been a treat. We're gonna try to get back and record these regularly again. We know we've been slacking. I had a kid 4 months ago. Shit's kind of crazy, but we're gonna get back at it. So you three people that are still listening, 52 minutes later, we appreciate you and hope to bring you more soon.
Appreciate your time, Trav. Thanks, listeners, for joining in. And until next time, this is the Outlap.
Hell yeah.